SpaceX may become one of the biggest IPOs in history, but Wall Street is already looking beyond the IPO itself because the real opportunity may be the companies quietly powering the entire SpaceX ecosystem. And with the next Starship launch approaching, investors are starting to pay attention. Today, we're breaking down 3 stocks connected to that trend. Hi everyone, this is Stock Market Breakdown. If you want to go beyond just watching price moves and actually understand the logic behind the market, make sure to like and subscribe. Let's dive right in. Starship is now entering a completely different phase. Earlier launches were mostly experimental, but version 3 is much closer to a production scale system, and that matters because Starship is becoming the foundation of SpaceX's long-term business model. This is no longer just about launching rockets, it's about scaling an entire global infrastructure platform. Because the real engine behind SpaceX today is increasingly Starlink, satellite internet, global communications, military connectivity, data transmission, and potentially much more over the next decade. Right now, Starlink has already become one of the most important parts of SpaceX's revenue ecosystem, and its Starship dramatically increases launch capacity. That could mean larger satellites, lower deployment costs, higher bandwidth, and much faster global expansion. That's why this launch matters far beyond aerospace enthusiasts. For investors, this is increasingly becoming an infrastructure story. And what's interesting is that this narrative actually looks very similar to what already happened in AI. At first, investors only focused on Nvidia, but eventually, the market started moving beyond the obvious winners. Power infrastructure companies, cooling systems, networking suppliers, memory manufacturers, entire ecosystem started rallying around a single technological trend. And now, some investors believe the space economy could follow a very similar pattern, because once a major platform starts scaling, Wall Street begins searching for every company connected to that growth cycle. And that brings us to the first company. The first stock is VELO3D. VELO3D specializes in advanced metal 3D printing systems used in aerospace manufacturing, and importantly, SpaceX has publicly disclosed the company as a supplier. The reason investors care is relatively simple. As rocket production scales, traditional manufacturing methods become less efficient. Complex engine components increasingly rely on high-precision additive manufacturing, and that creates potential long-term demand for companies capable of producing those systems. Now, to be clear, this is still a highly speculative small-cap company. The balance sheet risks are real. The stock can also be extremely volatile, but in momentum-driven markets, narratives tied to SpaceX can move very quickly, especially when investors begin connecting the company to a much larger industry trend. The second company is STMicroelectronics. At first glance, it doesn't really look like a stay stock. Most investors associate the company with industrial semiconductors and automotive chips, but STMicroelectronics also supplies components used inside Starlink terminals, and as satellite internet adoption continues expanding globally, that ecosystem could continue growing alongside it. This is part of a broader shift happening across the market right now. Investors are no longer only buying the platform companies themselves, they're increasingly buying the suppliers behind those platforms. We already saw this happen throughout the AI infrastructure cycle, and now, some investors believe the same thing could eventually happen across the space economy, because if Starlink continues scaling globally, the supporting supply chain may become increasingly valuable too. The third company is Intuitive Machines. Unlike many speculative space startups, Intuitive Machines has already completed lunar missions and works alongside NASA programs. The company is positioning itself around long-term lunar infrastructure, communications systems, and payload delivery. And this is where the bigger story starts becoming interesting, because if Starship eventually reduces launch costs significantly, the economics of operating in space could change dramatically. Entirely new industries could become economically viable: satellite communications, Earth observation systems, defense infrastructure, orbital manufacturing, and potentially even space-based AI computing infrastructure in the future. That may sound extreme today, but many of today's largest industries once sounded unrealistic during their early stages too, and that's exactly why Wall Street is beginning to pay attention now, before the ecosystem becomes fully priced in. Another reason investors are focusing on this trend is because public market exposure to SpaceX itself remains extremely limited. Most investors still cannot directly buy SpaceX shares, and historically, when private market opportunities become difficult to access, Wall Street often starts buying the surrounding ecosystem instead. We already saw similar behavior during previous technology booms, and now, SpaceX may be becoming the next major narrative trade. Not necessarily because every company involved will become successful, but because capital tends to flow aggressively toward emerging themes during the early stages of a cycle. Of course, none of these companies are risk-free. Many remain highly speculative, unprofitable, and heavily narrative-driven. And if Starship fails, these stocks could sell off very aggressively. There's also another major risk investors may be underestimating: SpaceX itself. Because Elon Musk has a long history of vertically integrating critical technologies, which means some suppliers benefiting today could eventually face direct competition from SpaceX in the future. So this is not necessarily a long-term buy and hold story. For many investors, this is more about understanding where momentum and narrative capital may flow next. But this is exactly how major market themes often begin. First comes the technology, then comes the narrative. Then Wall Street starts searching for the companies connected to that narrative. And right now, SpaceX may be evolving from a private rocket company into an entire public market ecosystem. This is Stock Market Breakdown. See you in the next one.